in Acts 24. So in the early days of the English Reformation, when the Anglican Church was in its infancy, there were a handful of prominent figures who stood out from among the rest as leaders in this movement. And one of those men was named Hugh Latimer. And Hugh Latimer was known for being a very strong and eloquent preacher at St. Paul's Cross. And he was often heard by the king himself, Henry VIII. And one week during a particularly bold sermon, Latimer said something that offended the king. And so a week later, he was called to the king's court to make a formal apology for what he had said in that previous week's sermon. And so as he was called forward, he stood up and to give his remarks, and he stopped to address himself first, and this is what he said, and this is Old English here. He said, Hugh Latimer, dost thou know before whom thou art this day to speak? To the high and mighty monarch, the king's most excellent majesty, who can take away thy life if thou offendest. Therefore take heed that thou speakest not a word that may displease, but then consider well, Hugh, also. Dost thou not know from whence thou comest, upon whose message thou art sent? Even by the great and mighty God, who is all present and who beholdeth all thy ways and is able to cast thy soul into hell. Therefore take care that thou deliverest thy message faithfully. And so then, with that out of the way, he turns to the king and opens his mouth and delivers the exact same sermon he had preached the week before with more passion and more vigor. So it's that kind of boldness, and I aspire to that level of, is that kind of boldness that we have been witnessing from Paul over these last few weeks, because he's made his defense as these false charges against him, and he's faced a mob, he's faced the Sanhedrin, and now he is being brought before the governor to give an answer. And as we look at his words this morning, we see a parallel with history, because he doesn't back up, he doesn't recant, he does not apologize, but he continues to explain himself boldly. He sticks to the truth. He gives the same speech time and time again, boldly pointing back to the hope that can only be found in Jesus. And when we see that when he comes to this governor, first he explains, number one, what he was. And so we start in verse 10. It says, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, because I know you have been a judge of this nation for many years, I am glad to offer my defense in what concerns me. You can verify for yourself that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They didn't find me arguing with anyone or causing a disturbance among the crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogue or anywhere in the city. Neither can they prove the charge they are now making against me. So last week when we left off with Paul, he was being brought back to the barracks after the Sanhedrin exploded into a heated debate over the resurrection, which was held by the Pharisees and the majority of the Jewish community, but not by the Sadducees, who had a very different view of the afterlife altogether. The Sadducees being a minority who were in dominant power at this time in Jerusalem. And so the Roman soldiers removed him and has now taken him before the governor Felix. And this is 5 days later, presumably after things have calmed down. The high priest Ananias, a pawn of the Roman Empire, made his way with some legal representation to meet before the governor and lay out their charges against Paul. And we see what they said. If you back up for a moment to verse 5, Tertullus said, for we have found this man to be a plague, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the Roman world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to desecrate the temple, and so we apprehended him. So in the way they have put their argument together, very different from how they put it together before. They probably had structured this address with Ananias' help, with his knowledge of how power worked in the empire. They attempt to make themselves out as allies to the governor. They acknowledge that this is indeed a Jewish dispute, yes, but it's one that affects the Roman world. By agitating or stirring up people, he could possibly be inciting them to riot against Rome, which was a charge of treason against the empire. And then they carefully add in that Paul had tried to desecrate the temple since they had no hard proof and it was only a rumor in the beginning. And though it was not really of any true concern to the Roman governor, the effects of that in stirring up the people of Jerusalem would have given them full cause to apprehend him and consider him an enemy to peace in Israel. And so in all of this, they tie him to that sect of the Nazarenes, a term for the believers in Jesus who were starting to come to the attention of the empire at this time as the gospel was spreading. And they specifically designate these Christians as members of a sect, which in modern parlance would basically, they're saying this guy is part of a cult. And so these are the same charges, these charges that have been following him for some time now, though now they're packaged very cleverly in pandering language to represent Paul not just as a threat to their Jewish religion, but also to Roman national security. Others in the crowd stood up and they testified, they were probably paid for this, stood up and testified that this was the case, that this was true. And now in verse 10, Paul is given the clearance to speak. He's invited to share his side of the story. And like Latimer before King Henry, Paul begins where he began before, declaring his innocence, but also the good news. So he begins by denying the charges laid against him, that he had not stirred up a riot, he had not even begun any kind of dispute, he hadn't even gone into a synagogue to engage in debate, as was his custom, that he was not the treasonous threat that they made him out to be. And they had no proof of this. They could offer nothing to verify their claims. But not everything they had said was a lie. And there was one charge that he would freely admit to. It says in verse 14, "But I admit this to you, I worship the God of my ancestors according to the way," which they call a sect, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and written in the prophets. He says, so I'm not the treasonous threat, though I am with those they call the Nazarenes. But he throws away the title of sect as if they were some aberrant religion that had begun from without to come in and compete with the Jewish faith. But he said, no, but this is the way that is in line with the teaching of the law and the prophets. It is not a supersession, but it is a fulfillment. And this is an important theological point, not just for Paul, but also for us to understand. Because Christianity, which was at this point called the way, is not a new upstart religion that Jesus brought to throw over the apple cart. Our faith is not to be divorced from its origins. The God of Israel who spoke through the Old Testament prophets is the same God who spoke to the writers of the New Testament. Christianity is not to be considered a new religion, but a fulfillment of the old. We believe that the story of the Bible is that God gave his promise to Abraham, kept his promise through Israel, Abraham's descendants, fulfilled his promise in Jesus, and continues his promise in all who believe in him, Jew and Gentile alike. The people of God are the people of God. And there's no division in there hiding somewhere, keeping you outside from the faith that was established with Abraham. God gave those Old Testament prophets the same promises that you get to see and receive. The promise of a Messiah is yours, and it was fulfilled in Jesus. The promise of new life and a renewed world is yours, and it is given to you in Jesus. The promise of the Holy Spirit is yours just as much as it was to those Jewish people who remembered the words of the prophet Joel. Why is this important for us to remember? Well, first, because we need to remember that when we read the Bible, we are reading one story, not two. It's not that God was trying to do one thing and he couldn't really get that to work out, and so he went to plan B. That's not the way this works. All who believe in Jesus are God's people. All who accept the Messiah, those who had in the past, who had hoped for a Messiah, going all the way back to Adam and Eve, who waited for the one whose heel would crush the serpent's head, are just as much believers as those who saw him rise on that first Resurrection Sunday. Those who believe and hope in him are the people of God. It makes no difference whether they were grafted in or they were just grew like that. This is also important today. Not only that the Bible is a unified story telling us one thing, it's also important today because we are again seeing 100 years later, a strong rise of anti-Semitism in public discourse. And it's one thing that there's two extremist groups that this is the one thing they seem to agree on, which I think is a little odd. But this rise is coming even from those who say they are Christian. Now, let me be clear. I'm not talking about people who disagree with a government's decisions or disagree with this or that. I'm talking about those who despise Jewish people because they are Jewish. That is what anti-Semitism is. And it is on the rise, and even from those who call themselves Christians. And anti-Semitism is a detestable evil in the sight of God, just like all forms of racism are a detestable sin, because God made humans in his image, and we don't get to choose how he displays that image. God chose Abraham and his descendants to bring the Messiah into the world, to free us from sin and death, and he chose Jew and Gentile alike to bring his kingdom in the fullness of that promise to the earth. And Christianity is not a counter movement. It is the fulfillment of all that God intended. The church is to be a foretaste of the new creation, a people of all nations, peoples, tribes, and tongues who join their voices together to worship and adore the God Most High. Paul says, I am not a rebel, I am not an agitator, but I am a follower of the promises. I'm a follower of Jesus. I believe that the God who promised to our ancestors has kept his promises today. But he does not leave it that he is just a follower. Because it's one thing to say, I'm in line with that. It's another, because our faith is not just something we follow, it's something that affects the way we view everything. He explains why he has such boldness, why he has such hope. He explains not just what he is, but he also explains, number two, what he believed. It says in verse 15, here it is, I have a hope in God, which these men themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection, both of the righteous and of the unrighteous. And so here he returns again, repeating that same offensive point, just like Hugh Latimer did when we spoke originally. This point that tore all civility away from the Sanhedrin Council, an issue just as important today as it was then, just as divisive today as it was then, and just as full of hope today as it was then. There will be a resurrection. This event we first find mentioned in Daniel chapter 12, a hope that encapsulates all of the hope of Israel, a hope that they all share together except the minority of the Sanhedrin and the Sadducees, a hope that though they had suffered throughout their history in slavery and captivity, siege, conquest, and occupation, that there is a day coming when it all will be restored and they will be vindicated for their faith in the God of their fathers. Though all around them that men they have laughed and mocked and scoffed at their idea of this one God who led them to the promised land, who took them out of Egypt, who made a covenant with them, who they think cares about them. But there is a day coming when they will be vindicated. There's a day when they will be resurrected, and all the world will know that what they were telling about this God of their fathers was the truth. And the foretaste of that day was shown in Jesus, who bore the shame and reproach of mankind and died on the cross for all the world to see. Condemned and abandoned, he died and was buried. And in his resurrection, it was declared to all the world that he was telling the truth, that he was the Messiah who was promised, the anointed one who had been raised and exalted at the right hand of God, the suffering servant who became the conquering king, vanquishing death in his wake. In Jesus, the hope of Israel was given an advanced deposit. God had come, and he had indeed begun to set it all right. He had come to put away sin and evil. He'd come to free humanity from the oppression of corruption and death, and he did it through this Messiah named Jesus, who Paul and those like him followed, those followers of the way. There has been a resurrection, and there will be a resurrection. What does that mean for us? It's not just an empty defense that Paul's giving. It means this. And I think this is very important this year, where we've seen so much death, where we've seen so much loss in our little church family. Everyone you have lost, every mother or father, brother, sister, husband, wife, friend, every son or daughter, born or unborn, every friend and mentor, all who have fallen asleep in Christ, they are not forever lost, they will be found again. All who have suffered from poverty, disease, and violence, exploitation, and apathy will be raised again. And their cries of pain, hunger, and distress will finally and truly be answered. All of the wrongs that have been done will be corrected. All who have been taken from you will be restored. Peace will come, nothing missing and nothing broken. Peace like this world has never seen before. It means that though we are surrounded by injustice, God one day will bring ultimate justice. When Paul speaks of the resurrection, he's not just speaking of a return to life. He is referring to when it happens, the end of the age, when Christ returns with a never-ending kingdom. The righteous will be raised to life, but the unrighteous to judgment. All accounts that stand open will be called forward. Every injustice will be corrected. Every evil finally put down. The resurrection of the just and the unjust is simply another way of saying that we are not left abandoned to grope about in the dark, hoping for the best outcome, but that God remembers his people. He remembers his promise, and the judge of all the earth, as Abraham said all those centuries ago, will do right. All that has been ruined will be restored. We think of our friends and neighbors in North Carolina, entire towns wiped away. Children, parents, brothers, sisters lost. All that has been ruined will be restored. Lives washed away will be made new. That which is broken will be mended. What's missing will be found. The old will pass away and all will be new. This is what the old theologians called the blessed hope. Because the hope of Christianity is the same as the ancient Jewish hope. Not that we go to the right place when we die and float on a cloud forever, and maybe you get a new skill given to you to play the harp for a while. It's not that we take off out of here and throw a match behind us on the way out, but that God would keep his promise to restore the creation back to the way it was supposed to be. It was never about escape for them. It was about restoration. It's that we are no longer separated from God, but that he has come again to dwell with us. And all that has been broken apart, all that breaks us apart, all death, disease, sin, corruption, and brokenness are put away forever, locked into outer darkness. And that is the Christian hope. That's what Paul is saying. The followers of the way are not this new crazy religion worshiping this rebel. No, he says it's the same hope that God has revealed to them over the centuries, and that the work to begin this, that this has all started, has begun in Jesus. Now, why is this ancient Jewish hope made by these people who view the world totally different from us, didn't even have electricity, didn't have social media, which maybe we should get back to that. Why is this ancient idea, ancient belief so important to us? Is it just an obscure theological trifle, a cool fact to tuck away in the back of your mind, an academic exercise that helps us know more about the Bible and history and ancient civilizations? No, it's much more than that. Because though we're centuries, thousands of years in the future from these people, I think we have a lot of the same concerns. Because sometimes we need hope to hang our hat on. Sometimes when we see corruption and poverty and death and exploitation and greed and corruption in our world, it's easy to lose hope. The same thing they were facing. Sometimes we need a buoy to keep our head above water. And, there's nothing about an intellectual exercise that can help that. There's no right and trite explanation to wash that all away. Nobody can explain this away. You can't think your way out of it. Real problems are real problems. And when we come to those problems, we don't need simple pat rubber stamp answers. We need real hope, a hope that reaches back into the corridors of time and is anchored in the revelation that God gave throughout history, that he will not leave us alone, that though we've left Eden for now, Eden will come to us. So ask yourself the same question that they had to ask. Are you tired of the brokenness of this world? Are you tired of disease taking away the people that you know? Are you tired of corruption and injustice and greed? Then there is hope. And I'm not talking about getting who you want in charge of the government, getting rid of the people you don't like, because that's not what it's about. That's just a temporary fix to a permanent problem. There is hope, because there will be a resurrection. And what that means is that the work that God began in Jesus will be completed in and through our world, here with us, here and now, thousands of years later in 21st century America, which this is not ripped up, which is currently ripped apart by religious, political, and ethnic division. Our hope remains the same, that when God began, what God began through Jesus didn't stop because the calendar changed. It didn't stop because the culture changed. God began his work of restoration in and through us, the church, universal, in our world, and he continues it today, and he will complete it on that last day. And we need not fear the future, because we know how it ends. Paul's not afraid of what this governor will say, because he knows how it ends. It ends with God, who began his promise with Abraham, kept his promise with his people Israel, fulfilled his promise in Jesus, and continued to promise with us, the people of God who've been grafted in, bringing his work of redeeming the world to a final end. That is what Paul believed, and that's what we believe. At least I hope you do. We believe in the resurrection of the dead and what? The life of the world to come. Those ancient words ever true. So we may not be quite in the same situation that Paul is, literally the whole world against him. But every time when we stand and we feel as if everything's working against us, we're swimming upstream, we're always walking upstairs, which for some people is harder than others, you have this same hope. It's not always going to be this way. When you lose that loved one, when you lose that friend, when you see what the corrupt systems of this world are doing to people like you and me around the world, there's still hope. Our hope is not found in escape. It's not found in worldly powers. It's found that there is coming a day when God will put it all right. The resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come, and a kingdom without end. Amen. Please stand.